I call the honourable member Holly Walker, but can I just advise if you could speak into the microphone? It's very difficult to hear.
I don't believe it was turned on, Mr Speaker, but thank you. Mr Speaker, the Green Party takes electoral reform very seriously, and the fate of the parties and MPs that are currently represented in Parliament may wax and wane, but if the system for electing them is robust, democratic and fair, then we can all have confidence in our Parliament. And in the Green Party, we have always engaged constructively with any moves to alter this electoral system, such as the review of MMP that followed the referendum, and such as the inquiry into the 2011 general election which gave rise to this bill. Mr Speaker, we share the view that where possible, changes to the electoral system should be made with a high degree of political consensus so that the public can have confidence that the electoral system and the changes to it have not been politicised. Unfortunately, Mr Speaker, in the case of both the MMP review and now this bill, that consensus has broken down. Mr Speaker, I sat on the committee which conducted the inquiry into the 2011 general election. It was my first experience of a select committee inquiry, and although we got bogged down at times, and it took probably longer than it should, I was very proud of the report that the committee produced. There was genuine cross-party consensus for the recommendations in that report, and they were good recommendations. This bill before the House today, as it was originally drafted, was based on those recommendations, and that's why we in the Green Party supported it. In particular, we strongly support the move to full online enrolment, which removes a considerable barrier for people to get onto the electoral roll and vote. Under the status quo, although it's possible to update your enrolment details online, you still have to sign and send back a form to complete that enrolment process. And for many people, the envelope gets lost in the pile on the kitchen table or somehow falls through the cracks, gets lost in the mail or the car, and it doesn't happen. So allowing full online enrolment using the Real Me electronic identification system would allow the full process to happen online, and it's a really positive step towards maximising enrolment and voter turnout, and we continue to strongly support it. We also strongly support the provisions in this bill to tighten rules around the disclosure of donations, specifically the new rule that loans to a political party or candidate will be treated as donations and disclosed accordingly. This removes the loophole that allowed donors to call their donation a loan to avoid disclosure, but then to forgive that loan after the election, meaning that it never got declared. And removing that loophole is a really important step towards transparency and open government. There are also a number of other smaller changes in the bill which we also strongly support, Mr Speaker, but although we consider that much of this bill is positive, we are unable to support it at third reading today. And there are two reasons for this. The first is the deletion of the clauses that would have modernised the use of the Easy Vote card to streamline processes on election day. And secondly, and more importantly, is the inclusion of a requirement that a voter must make a verbal confirmation of their identity before they can vote. Both of these changes were made by the Select Committee, despite the fact that the very same Select Committee, albeit with slightly different membership, had already agreed to the recommendations of the 2011 election inquiry. So effectively, the committee reversed some of its own recommendations. Now, I was not present for the committee's deliberations. I was on parental leave during the last part of last year. But my understanding is that these changes were made out of an apparent concern that the use of the Easy Vote card on election day could contribute to an increased risk of electoral fraud. And we've heard a little bit about that in this debate so far. Mr Speaker, this assumption is simply wrong. The Easy Vote card, as members know, is a card listing the voter's name, address and the line and page number that their name appears in the electoral roll. It makes it easier and faster for polling booth staff to find them on the roll and issue their voting papers on election day. For voters for whom English is a second language or who have speech, hearing or other impairments, it makes the process of voting much easier and less intimidating because all they need to do is hand over a card and their voting paper can be issued with minimal opportunity for stress or confusion. It is not an ID card. Yes, Mr Speaker, it is theoretically possible that somebody could take an Easy Vote card belonging to another voter along to a polling booth and use it to cast a vote in their name. It's equally possible that someone intent on doing this could go along to the polling booth and give someone else's name and address. The risk is neither increased nor decreased by the use of the Easy Vote card. The one example of electoral fraud which has been raised by Scott Simpson in this debate is not relevant to this debate for two reasons. First of all, it applied to local elections, not a general election. And second of all, and more importantly, it was picked up by the processes in place to check these things and subsequently prosecuted, Mr. Speaker. In the minute number of cases when this happens, it gets picked up by the Electoral Commission. And if, for example, somebody took someone else's Easy Vote card along to the booth and tried to cast a vote in their name, it gets picked up when the genuine voter goes later on and casts their own vote. And if it's found that someone else has already voted in their name, there are systems in place. It hardly ever happens, Mr. Speaker, but when it does, the Electoral Commission has robust processes in place to act and deal with it. Now, the proposal in this bill, as it was originally drafted, was to make the Easy Vote card scannable so that the Electoral Commission could use it as a record of a vote cast and electronically cross the voter off the roll more quickly and easily, in fact making it more easy to pick up instances of fraud. This is a sensible change that would not have changed the use of the Easy Vote card from the voter perspective at all. Therefore, the fear that this bill would lead to greater use of the Easy Vote card and that this in turn could lead to greater electoral fraud is simply wrong. At best, this was an erroneous fear which should have been corrected and reassured at the Select Committee. At worst, Mr. Speaker, it's a deliberate red herring. Either way, myself and a number of our Labour colleagues realised this mistake and offered SOPs during the committee stages to reinstate the clauses related to the Easy Vote card and allow the Electoral Commission to proceed with its plans to improve its back-end processes on election day. These SOPs were rejected with no rationale provided by the government, and that is a real shame. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, seemingly in response to the same fear about fraud, a new requirement has been introduced that voters must verbally confirm their identity to polling booth staff when they hand over their Easy Vote card. This is unnecessary. It again neither increases nor decreases the risk of fraud because somebody set on committing electoral fraud could simply say that they were the person in whose name they sought to vote. But for those voters I mentioned earlier, those with impairments, or those for whom English is a second language, or those for whom simply getting out to vote and engaging with the polling booth staff is a scary prospect, for whatever reason, this adds a barrier to voting, a completely unnecessary and useless barrier, but a barrier nonetheless. For some voters, the outcome of having to give that verbal confirmation could be that they choose not to engage with the system and that they choose not to vote. Now, some members of this House will roll their eyes and say it's hardly a major barrier. This bill, indeed, provides for voters to use a gesture, a poorly conceived inclusion, to cover voters with impairments if they are unable to verbally confirm. But I put it to those members that we, as largely able, politically engaged, high-status individuals in this House, are in no position to judge what barriers those marginalised citizens may experience when it comes to voting. It should be our role to ensure that our electoral law makes it as easy as possible for anyone and everyone who is eligible to vote to cast their vote. And that means not adding a useless and frankly quite insulting requirement to verbally or by gesture confirm one's identity at the polling booth. If even a handful of voters choose not to exercise their right to vote because of this additional barrier that we are putting in place today, then that will reflect very badly indeed on this House. It is chiefly for this reason, Mr. Speaker, that the Green Party has withdrawn our support for this bill at third reading. We continue to support many of its provisions, especially for online enrolment and for the disclosure of loans as donations. But we cannot support any legislation in this House that adds a barrier to vote for some of our most marginalised citizens. And we are disappointed that this House did not see fit to work constructively together to remove that barrier before we reach the third reading today.
Good speech, Holly.
I call the honourable member Ian Foster-Bell.
Paul Foster-Bell, Mr. Speaker.
I'm sorry.
Kia ora,
Paul
sir.
Foster-Bell.